Hello, everybody. A really warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the new World Risk Poll, Engineering Safer Workplaces, Global Trends in Occupational Safety and Health. My name's Beth Elliott, and I am Director of Strategic Communications at Lloyd's Register Foundation. We're a global safety charity with a mission to engineer a safer world. I'm absolutely delighted to be moderating this webinar today. I'm really excited to be discussing the findings of the report with our very esteemed panelists, to whom I will introduce you now. So we're joined by Balit Nafradi, Balance Technical Officer of Occupational Safety and Health Data at the International Labour Organization. And we've been working closely with Balance and the ILO to support the development of this report. We're joined by Sarah Isher, who leads the MSD Solutions Lab and serves as Environmental Health and Safety Manager at the National Safety Council in the USA, where she focuses on supporting employers to reduce workplace injuries and deaths. We're also joined by Chris Alderson, CEO of Construction Health and Safety New Zealand Trust, a charitable organisation dedicated to improving the health, safety and well-being of construction workers in New Zealand. And we're also joined by Alan McCullough, OBE, who is the coordinator of the International Fund for Fishing Safety, an initiative recently established by Lloyd's Register Foundation and managed by the Seafarers Charity to improve the safety of fishers worldwide. And lastly, but no means least, Aaron Gardner, Senior Data Scientist at Lloyd's Register Foundation, who is going to run through the findings of the report for us shortly. So we're going to start, as I said, with Aaron's presentation. That's going to be followed by a panel discussion for around 30 minutes. And after that, we'll have around 20 minutes for audience Q&A. But please don't wait till the end. You can submit your questions at any time during the session by going into the questions pane on the GoToWebinar control panel. So as I said, please don't wait. You can submit your questions throughout the session and we'll get through as many of them as we can. So again, a huge welcome to everybody who's joined us. And I'm going to hand over to Aaron to talk us through the findings of the report. Thank you, Aaron.
Thanks for the introduction, Beth. So I'm going to quickly run through some of the key findings from the report that we've just launched. But before that, I'll give a brief introduction to what the World Risk Poll is. So every 2 years, Lloyd's Register Foundation runs this World Risk Poll, and it asks questions about people's experiences and perceptions of risk and safety. It's a really global study, so we get unheard voices and unserved regions where currently there are data gaps or we just don't have any data at all. And we're now in our third edition. And in this wave, we polled over 140,000 people across 142 countries. This is the third report of our current wave, and it's Engineering Safer Workplaces, Global Trends in Occupational Safety and Health. And you can download it now from our website. So the question is why are we concerned about occupational safety and health? Well, out of the global workforce of 3.5 billion, the ILO estimates that 3 million people a year die from work-related accidents or diseases, and another 400 million sustain non-fatal injuries, which can impact their individual's life, long-term health, and also the quality of their life. And also, whilst the World Risk Poll is focused on individual experience, you also need to acknowledge the impact such harm has on productivity for employers and across sectors as well. Workplace harm has been a core element of all three waves of the World Risk Poll. We've asked questions about it in all three waves to date. And this stemmed from our foresight review of global safety evidence in 2018, where we realized that there was a lack of global data around workplace safety and that changing workplaces and ways of working, along with emerging technologies, were changing how we needed to think about safety in the workplace. So with that, we'll move on to some of the data that we've seen through the various waves of the report. Here, we can see that experience of harm at work is a global issue. In 2023, 18% of the workforce say that they've experienced harm at work in the previous 2 years. But if we look back at the same question in the previous years, we can see that it's essentially flat. What's really interesting, though, is in 2019, the question was asked in a slightly different way. In 2021 and 2023, we ask about if you've experienced serious harm at work, but leave that interpretation of harm open to the respondent. In 2019, we specifically asked about serious injury whilst working. As you can see from the fact that they're flat across the waves, we can make a strong assumption that most respondents, when they answer this question, are thinking about physical harm that they experience at work. So although the trends are flat across the years, they always hide quite a lot of variation within them. Here we're looking at the 2023 data, and this is specifically for people in the workforce. They've self-identified as being as part of the workforce. And we can see what happens when we split it by various demographics. Men are more likely than women to say they've experienced harm. And if we look at the age groups, we can see that younger age groups in particular are more likely to say that, with the 15 to 29 age group being above the global mean. Education is also a very strong driver or a strong associator of experiencing workplace harm, with those who only have a primary education significantly more likely than those with secondary or tertiary education to report experiencing harm. And one of the real powers of the World Risk Poll is that we ask questions about a variety of different things, not just simple demographics that we can cross the data with. And one really interesting finding is this final bit at the bottom of the chart, which looks at financial resilience. So in the poll, we asked people, if your household lost access to all income, how long would you be able to cover basic needs? And you can see here that households who say that they could only survive for less than a week are much more likely to have people reporting that they've experienced harm at work. So taken together, what we can sort of start to see a picture emerging is that people who are in more precarious types of work or who are more exposed to having to work in industries with less preventative measures and less safety measures in place are more at risk of experiencing harm. In this year's wave of the poll, we actually also asked about the sector of industry that people worked in to give us a breakdown of where harm may be more prevalent. And you can see at the top here, fishing, where 26% of respondents say they've experienced harm, was the industry or sector which had the greatest experience. We can drop down and see construction and mining and quarrying, both above the global mean. And then as we slip down below the global mean, we can see the electricity, gas and water supply, or the utilities, at the very bottom, where 10% of people say they reported harm. So there's a big difference, but all industries have workers who experience harm. So that summary, the run through of harm, we can see that it's a global issue, but it's not equally experienced across the globe or by people even within countries. But experience is only one aspect of harm. The World Risk Poll also asks about people's worry about experiencing that harm. And this creates a really interesting picture here. So this chart, we can see various questions we ask about people's worry and experience of harm. So things like severe weather, road traffic, water. The horizontal axis shows the proportion of respondents who are worried about experiencing that harm. And you can see over here on the right, we have traffic and severe weather, where there's a very high degree of worry about it. Whereas over on the left, we can see things like work and water, where there's a lower degree. The vertical axis shows the amount of harm that people report experiencing, or the occurrence of harm. And again, here we can see severe weather and traffic are highly up at the top end, suggesting there's a high experience, but also work has this high experience. But what's really interesting is when we split this graph into quadrants, and work here stands alone in the top left, where there's a high experience of harm in the workplace, but this is associated with a low level of worry. And we really want to understand what's the drivers for this difference. Why do people who maybe acknowledge that they have, why it's something where there's a serious risk of harm and people report a large amount of harm, why are people not concerned about it? Is it an issue of normalization, or are there other drivers that are empowering this? But one thing that we can say is that worry and increase of harm, they are associated in some way. So here on this chart, we can see the first column is people who've never been harmed or who say they've not been harmed at work. And here only 40% of people are concerned about experiencing harm. Those who say they know someone but have not personally experienced, we can see a significant jump up here. Over 30% more people say that they're worried about harm. When we turn that into personal experience, in the next column, we see a further near 10% increase. So we can say that knowing about harm or having a personal experience of a harm is a significant driver of worry about experiencing future harm. So to summarize those, we can say that harm at work is underappreciated compared to the risk that people actually experience. We want to understand why this maybe is the case. And so the first bit is to think about, is people reporting harm, is that the driver behind it? If people report harm, more people are aware of it and they're aware of the risks. And then also, does training in the workplace help people understand what harm maybe means? So in another question, we asked people who experienced harm at work. So this is not the whole workforce now, this is only people who've experienced harm at work. Did they go on to report that experience of harm to an official agency, so their employer or an agency, someone official? And you can see that globally, 51% of people reported it. compared to 49% of people who didn't. So that's quite a big shift there of why people aren't reporting it. And this underreporting may be a driver of why there's a relative lack of worry about harm at work if people aren't aware that it's happening. But then we also want to see what effect receiving occupational safety and health training had on this, and how the global picture of occupational safety and health training looked as well. So here we can see quite a stark example. 62% of workers say they have never received occupational safety and health training. 38% say they have, but only 30% say that they've received it within the previous 2 years. And as with the experience of harm, we can see significant variation here. Here I'm showing some regional breakdowns, but we can also see things based on the similar demographics that I've shown on previous slides. Eastern Europe leads the pack, where 59% of people have had training in the past 2 years, with a further 19% of people saying they have received training at some point. And we can go down the graph to the very bottom, where we see Northern Africa, where 11% of people say that 11% of workers say they've received occupational safety and health training in the previous 2 years, and a further 7% at some point. And you can definitely see there's a very clear regional split, with Africa and Asia being more prevalent towards the bottom of the graph. And what's very interesting is then when we split this by sector globally. So if you remember from the previous chart I showed, people who work in the utilities industry actually said they had the lowest reported level of harm, with 10% of people in the workforce of that sector saying they experienced harm. And this correlates really nicely with the level of training that we see in that sector. So 69% of people in the utility sector say they've received training in the previous 2 years, with a further 8% receiving it at some point. And this stands significantly higher than all of the other sectors that we polled about. At the other end of the scale, we can see fishing, where we had the highest reported levels of harm, with 26% of the workforce in the fishing industry saying they had experienced harm in the previous 2 years. However, this correlates the other way, where we can see that 73% of the fisher workforce say they've never received occupational safety and health training. So there's a really interesting picture emerging here that we should investigate further. But what's really interesting is when we look at how people who've received OSH training and whether they report experiencing harm. So the top chart here is people who've received OSH training. The bottom chart is the people who've never received it. And what we can see from the personal experience is that the numbers are very similar. They're within the margin of error. 19% of people who've received OSH training say they've personally experienced it, whereas 17% of people who haven't received it say they've experienced harm. But what really differs is the group of people who say they know someone. There's a 10 percentage point increase in people who've received OSH training. And this is suggesting maybe that having OSH training makes you aware of what harm at the workplace can be and how that could then affect you in the future. And finally, to end on a positive note, we also saw that receiving occupational safety and health training encouraged the reporting of harm. So these are odds ratios compared to people who don't report it. The bar on the right, we can see that people who've received OSH training, but not within the previous 2 years, are almost 2 times more likely to report harm at work compared to people who've received no training. But when that training occurs within the previous 2 years, we see another large jump again, and people are 3.3 times more likely to report harm at the workplace if they received OSH training in the previous 2 years. So to summarize, workplace harm is a global and perennial problem. We also know that it's a pernicious one given the impact it can have on people's health and quality of life, and also the relative lack of concern people have about it. One potential pathway that the data maybe suggests is that a lack of reporting leads to a lack of awareness, and this leads to a lack of concern. And if we can break this cycle, maybe we can increase people's concern around experiencing harm at work. We also show that OSH training is maybe a pathway for people to understand harm and contextualize it in their workplace, and then in turn, this may encourage their reporting of that. With those ideas and the questions and other questions in mind, I will move on to our summary slide before heading over to the discussion. So you can download the report and the expert commentary, read the expert commentary on our website now. We have bespoke country overviews for every country in the poll, which shows a curated breakdown of the data in this area and also the other areas of the poll. But you can also download the raw data for your own use or use our data explorer to explore the data and ask questions of it yourself. But please get in touch and ask any questions either in this seminar or after the seminar if you're thinking of using the data or to discuss partnering with us or any questions in general. And with that, I will hand back over to Beth.
Thank you, Aaron. Some really fascinating data that you've just presented to us. Obviously raises a lot of questions. So I'm going to invite the panelists to all come back, turn their cameras back on, and we can start a discussion around that data and the stats behind it and what it's kind of telling us. So I'd like to dig a little bit deeper, if I may, into kind of the initial stats that Aaron presented. And I'm going to come to you first, Balint. So the very first stats that we saw showed that there's a flat rate of harm in the workplace over the last 5 years. And Aaron mentioned that most people were looking at that from a physical sort of risk perspective. But what's your view on why generally we're not seeing that things are improving?
Yeah, thank you, Ian. First, thanks for the great work and the excellent report and data you collected over the years. So I want to start first that to me the main message is that occupational safety and health, or the safe and healthy working environment, is a fundamental principle of rights since 2002, and yet we don't see much of a change in the trend. So that means that it's not yet a reality for hundreds of millions of workers. So to me, the main message here is that it's that we have a lot of work to do. That's why it does not change over this period of 5 years. It has, I think, several reasons. First is that occupational safety and health is a complex multidisciplinary science. So us attributing it into one single number or a change of it, that probably oversimplifies the picture, as it was already shown in these figures. That there are a lot of things are changing for better or worse. Partially it's the global average is probably not the best measure for the everyday reality to look into. And maybe the other aspect of it has to do something with the fact that it's the question relates to the perception of harm, and we saw that it's not always linked to an actual experience or the knowledge of what risk might be. And so I would also think that people after a while saturated for all types of harms they might see it. So which one is the most prevalent in their actual life might get reported or not. And in that sense would even be that a higher rate of report of the perception of harm might actually show a good thing for us, in a sense of broader awareness and an improvement on the knowledge of harm, not necessarily the change in actual harm at workplaces.
That's great, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. It's a lot more complex than it might look on the face of it. Sarah, is there anything you wanted to add from your work at the National Safety Council with regards to sort of why we are seeing that those figures are flat?
Yeah, I think something that, Balint kind of mentioned was that our perceptions of harm have changed. And maybe what we had first thought about is just physical safety. It's now kind of moving into psychological safety as well. So over the past 5 years, kind of what we think about as being harmful has changed. So that could increase kind of the responses people are having. I think overall, we're in the United States, we're still seeing the top 3 reasons that people are injured or hurt at work are overexertion, bodily reaction, slips, trips, and falls, and that's remained pretty much the same. But if you look at the things that are taking people away from work, that has changed. So prior to 2020, we were seeing that those top 3 exposures are what were keeping people away from work. But with the addition of the COVID-19 pandemic, that kind of changed as well. So in the United States, from 2021 to 2022, which is the most recent Bureau of Labor Statistics information we have, exposure to harmful substances or environments took number 1 for the reason why that people are away from work in the United States. So that was a change. And I think that really opened up people to thinking and understanding about respiratory illness as something that is harmful at work as well.
That's really helpful. Thank you. A really sort of useful comments around what's happening in the US there. And Balint, I'm going to come back to you, sort of looking at listening to Sarah's comments. Is there anything we can take from those sort of geographical differences in terms of sort of what potentially the reasons are for such huge discrepancies between different parts of the world? Are there any sort of parts of the world that you want to particularly focus on and give us some insights into why you think certain things are happening there?
Yes, so every workplace is different, and that several factors which contribute to the experience of harm was already shown by Aaron. One I want to concentrate is age. You showed that younger workforce are more prevalent to harms. This is particularly true for physical type of injuries. So obviously regions or countries where the workforce is relatively young, there is a higher experience of higher prevalence of this kind of physical harms. But the contrary also true. Diseases tend to require time to develop. So that's more prevalent in countries or regions where the workforce is getting older. And also saw strong changes between industries, and countries and regions vary significantly on the makeup of the economy, that which industries are more important. But even if we look, say, agriculture, which was one of the big ones on the chart, the level of industrialization or automation of these industries, that also shifts what kind of risks are present at the workplace, or what's the prevalence of it. Clearly, if a lot of mechanical or human labor is done, then the risks and also the experience of harm is different than if it's more mechanized or chemicals are used, etc. So I think all of these factors are contributing to the differences that you see by region, by industry. It's important to dig into details when we try to make the reality of a given region or industry better.
That's great. Thank you. We're going to talk in a little bit about those sort of the sector-related statistics. But I just want to come to one of the really interesting points that Aaron made in his presentation, was around, while the risk of harm at work is significant, it seems that people aren't as worried about it as they probably should be. So Sarah, I know, and Aaron mentioned sort of, what the drivers behind that. Have you got any thoughts on what those drivers may be?
I think sadly sometimes people think that that's just the cost of going to work, right? Work is their mode of living. So they just kind of take that with being part of it, that they could be hurt at work. Also, maybe their workplace doesn't support the culture of either reporting or understanding, what the risks are. And I think a lot of it does come to training, because if you don't have training that helps identify what the risks are and why people should be worried and concerned with it, then it's not going to create that loop where they come back and realize this actually matters. I do need to, focus on this training. I do need to focus on working safely. But I think a lot of it does come down to, either the organization or the employer doesn't have the culture that supports it. Because if safety is kind of a priority to them, then they will be training, they will be educating the people, no matter if they've been on the job for 20 years or 2 days.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk about sort of safety culture in a little while, but I just want to move on to the sort of the reporting stats now. And Alan, I'd like to come to you first, if we can have a sort of a look at what's happening in the fishing industry. There was one particular stat that talks about the fact that less than half of part-time and self-employed workers report harm at work, yet they're one of the most affected groups. Are you seeing that in fishing? And if so, why do you think that's the case?
Well, thanks for the question, Beth, and thanks to LRF for allowing the fishing industry to have this seat. There's no doubt this is an issue in the fishing industry. At the very beginning of Aaron's presentation, he said that World Risk Poll was aimed at what I think he described as unheard voices. And that rang very true with me, because there was a conversation with a colleague in Brazil a few weeks ago when it shouldn't have come as a surprise, Beth, for somebody like me whose life has been in the fishing industry. But she described fishers across the world as feeling invisible. And I think that's a real shame. And I think that really does feed in to the kind of numbers that we're seeing demonstrated in the poll. A number of points to make. Certainly as far as the global fishing industry is concerned, there is no common or standard mechanism to report accidents, to report harm. And really that's something that we need to think about on an international basis and on a national basis as well. And it's something that through my work with the Fish Platform and IFS that we're also thinking about. There's also clearly a fear amongst fishers. In some parts of the world, there's a lot of fishers become migrants. Maybe their status as migrants is unclear. So they're afraid of reporting harm, reporting accidents in case that leads to repercussions. Many of the fishers, there's 39 million fishers in the world, Beth, and the vast majority of those can be found in Southeast Asia, often in remote locations, on beaches, let alone harbours. So the remoteness of them just gives another layer of difficulty in terms of reporting. But there's that key point that there's no standard way at international or indeed national level to report harm. And I think that's something that we really need to think about on a global basis.
Thank you, Alan. And I suppose when we look at the ILO's figures of, sort of harm at work, it could be much higher because, there's a lack of reporting or inability to report in some parts of the world. So Alan, staying with you, what can we do to help change that? Is it about more or easier to access reporting mechanisms, or is it about awareness, education? What do you think can be done to help improve that situation?
I like to come to events like this with a positive message. Like we can too often, Beth, deal on the negatives, and we can't underestimate the negatives in any one way. But I think the International Fund for Fishing Safety demonstrates what can be done. As you mentioned in the introductions, it's an initiative by Lloyd's Register Foundation in partnership with the Seafarers Charity and the Fish Platform. And the Fish Platform are the global group of fish safety experts. They're from over 100 people in over 32 countries and 5 continents. And it's bringing that expertise and that resource together to make a difference. So through IFS already, and we're only about 7 months into the program, we are supporting 6 projects from Ghana to Fiji, from Thailand to Kenya, from Vietnam to South Africa. And really that's focusing on training. It's focusing on training that comes with compliance or working towards compliance with international regulations. And so far, the numbers tell me that we're looking to support some 65,000 fishers. That's a small ripple, Beth, against a background of 39 million fishers in the world. And even if we take the WRP data that suggests that 73% of fishers have never received any training, it's a small start. But of course, every big wave begins with a small ripple.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Alan. Chris, I'm going to turn to you now for some comments around what's happening in the construction industry. A similar question, are you sort of seeing that people aren't really reporting harm at work? And again, what can be done to change that in the construction industry specifically?
Thanks, Beth. Thanks for the question. Well, I think it's actually a complicated question and a complicated answer. The construction industry's actually probably made up of 3 major parts of it. So we have the civil industry making up bridges and roads. We have the commercial industry building commercial buildings. And then we have the residential construction sector, which is probably by far the largest, building people's homes. And in the larger businesses, of course, we have quite good reporting. So if you're working for a large civil construction company or a large commercial builder, you're quite likely to have good processes and systems in place. However, the makeup of the industry is by far dominated by very small, almost micro businesses. If you get down into the construction trades, for example, plumbers, electricians, tilers, roofers, you're talking about 2 people in a van and a dog often travelling around, often between sites. They are quite itinerant, so they do travel between sites and work in multiple workplaces as well, which can be a barrier to reporting harm. But I think just to back up something Sarah said earlier as well, there is an element of normalisation of harm within construction. It is a physical industry. People are hands-on. They create things. And unfortunately, what's happened over the years, and it's a generational thing, is there's been an acceptance that a level of harm or pain is quite normal in terms of doing your job. It's very, very rare to find a construction worker over the age of about 35 that's not harbouring some long-term musculoskeletal issue, back, knee, shoulder, that sort of thing. So, getting them to report that when it's just seen as a normal part of life for them is unfortunately quite hard. It really takes quite a major accident or a major issue for them to think about reporting things, whereas perhaps, more working in a white-collar environment, we'd be a lot less hesitant about reporting being sore all the time. So there's that. Look, there's language and literacy issues as well, which are, of course, happen in other industries. And often there's yes, we have a lot of labour hire that works in construction too, and often their working visas conditions are often difficult for them, and maybe there's some barriers there too. So yes, it's a complicated industry, and there's many complicated reasons why people might not report harm. But look, we are getting some better pictures of it now, which is great.
That's great, thank you. Chris, I'm aware that you've got a lot of experience in sort of well-being as well as health and safety, and we talked a little bit earlier around or touched on sort of building a better workplace safety culture. We could also see from Aaron's slide that safety culture is where sort of well-being starts in safety critical industries. So have you got any advice for organisations, employers, as to how to build a better, I'm sure this is a huge question, right? But have you got any sort of immediate tips on where do you start with building a better safety culture in a workplace so that employees are encouraged to report incidents?
I think first of all, look, the term safety culture, it's a little bit abstract for a lot of small businesses to deal with, and quite often a bit challenging when you go and ask them to change their safety culture. What we've found is a little bit easier for them to get to grasp with is the concept of safety climate. Which is probably a component of safety culture. And what I mean by safety climate is the workers' perception of how well the organisation takes their health and safety, the priority of it within that they're personally feeling. So that is something that you can measure quite easily and talk about. And it sort of comes down to two things usually. And one is the overall impression of the organisation. Does the business actually take health and safety as a priority? And the other one is, does my direct supervisor? So often it comes down to who I'm actually working for. Quite often I'll go onto a site or talk to a team, and I'll say something like, what's health and safety here like? And invariably they'll say something like, depends who you work for, mate, or something like that. So it really does come down to what we call them. I guess you'd call them the culture leaders, which are those on-site supervisors, those leading hands, those men and women who are the forepeople of those sites, because they really do make the difference. And I think one of the things we've really looked at with construction workers is injecting some core competencies into that supervisory level. And it's not just the technical skills about, do you understand health and safety legislation? Do you understand risk? Do you understand controls? It's some of those, I wouldn't call them softer skills, but more complete skills around pastoral care, around planning, around dealing with conflict, around communication, that often a lot of construction workers who then get elevated to supervisory level don't get formal training in. So that's a real gap within construction supervisors. And what we're finding is by giving them the support around that, we're actually creating the cultures on site that actually allow people to be a lot more confident and have that sort of safe climate where they can actually report things. Does that make sense?
Absolutely makes sense. And I think that's probably not just in the construction industry, right? I think those kind of training the trainer almost is something that can be useful across different industries. So I'm going to come on to training now, because I know that was a big sort of chunk of Aaron's presentation. And the data that was presented to us showed us that 73% of fishers have never had occupational safety and health training, and we know that this is a high-risk industry. So Alan, how do we go about training all those, those artisanal fishers or small-scale fishers? How does that actually happen in practice? Because I imagine there's many barriers to doing that.
Well, there is, Beth, but the World Risk Poll presents a positive side of it as well. It provides evidence that where there is training, that harm and risk can reduce. And the slides that Aaron demonstrated clearly show that where there's a lack of training, that equates to more harm. But when you delve into the World Risk Pool, it also shows in those countries and those regions where there is training, there's less harm. And that rings very much true of the fishing industry. I think a lesson for me over the past number of months coming from Europe, Beth, and being used to the definitions of harm and safety and issues like that within the European fishing industry, there's different forms of harm right around the world. And like some of the things that have shocked me in some ways, that you speak to fishers in Mexico who are divers, their biggest issue is actually being attacked by sharks. You then go to Kenya, to Lake Victoria, one of their biggest issues is being attacked by crocodiles. So the point that I'm getting to here is that there's not one fishing industry across the world. Actually, when you look at coastal states, there's not one fishing industry. The fishing industry differs, and that equates to unique, bespoke solutions. And that means actually listening to fishers. It's not a case that even through the International Fund for Fishing Safety that we're parachuting into some region of the world saying this is what has to be done. Yes, we've got international standards, and we encourage people to work towards compliance with international standards. But importantly, Beth, it's listening to people on the ground. It's listening to fishers, not dictating to them, but listening to what they need and what they require, and adapting the training to suit specific needs.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. Thank you, Alan. So have you got anything to add to that, Sarah? I'm just, thinking about what sort of different mechanisms or processes could we put in place to ensure that A, training happens, but B, that it's effective, building on what Alan says. Does it need to be bespoke, based on the feedback from the end user, from local voices?
Yeah, I think any good health and safety management system has to start with exactly what Alan says. You have to meet people where they are and understand what they need to be successful, and kind of looking at those overall risk groups. I think that's where you should really be kind of building your training from, using the data to understand what's causing issues, what people need to be trained to do before they enter the workforce or into the certain job. But there really needs to be kind of a standard around checking in with people and making sure the training that you have instituted is actually working, evaluating it, and being okay with changing it. Because, it's easy to say you need to do this training once every 2 years, but their job tasks might be changing, or the way that they're doing things are changing, or the equipment has changed. So I think just ensuring that you have that communication loop between the supervisor and the worker to understand whether or not what you've instituted is effective.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Chris, I'm going to come back to you to talk specifically about what you're seeing in New Zealand. So we again can see from the data that there's lots of sort of room for improvement in the number of construction workers that are occupational safety and health trained. What types of training are you seeing that are being the most effective at the moment in New Zealand that you can share with people?
I think the interesting thing is I think it's changing. I think for many years the type of training that was put into construction was very general, and it's a little bit of a New Zealand term, but we call it sheep dip training, which means you push everyone through a process and then not worry about, and then you let them free onto the site after they've been through that process without actually checking they've actually picked up the knowledge that they need, just to say you've done it. So there's been a lot of legal compliance sort of tick box type stuff, because it is written into our legislation that the employer should actually provide appropriate training for it. But unfortunately, again, I back up what Sarah said, in that if you're not actually checking the effectiveness of that training and making sure that it's fit for purpose in terms of what the construction worker or the worker actually needs to support them in actually dealing with some of the volatile risks you see on a construction site, then it's probably not effective. So what we are seeing is different ways of training. So we do know that learners learn differently. Not everybody's the same. The way we've traditionally done it, sticking people in a room and then lecturing to them, with slides, perhaps isn't the way that a lot of construction people have chosen to learn in the past. Often they've been through school and they've come out the other side. They haven't gone to university, but they've gone onto a construction site because they want to learn a certain way, and they learn by doing. So they learn with their hands, they learn kinesthetically. So that means that a lot more learning is starting to happen on site with really good supervision again. So, if we can actually give people what they need when they need it and support them through that, that tends to be a lot more effective than, as Sarah said, every 2 years sticking them in a room and then expecting them to actually listen to you, which frankly they don't. So look, that's probably the evolution. The world's changing as well. Look, there's a lot more tools and techniques to actually reduce the cost of training and make it more effective. But the key thing is that, competency and knowledge is different than training, but competency and knowledge is actually the end goal for workers. The training is just the process or the route that may help them getting there, or one of them.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I like that competency and knowledge are the key things. And I really like what you said about the fact we all learn differently, right? So it's about working out what works best for different people and offering a variety of different training opportunities for people. A number of you have touched on the kind of question around certain industries obviously have the high rates of sort of transient workers or even undocumented workers. And obviously that leads to sort of a number of different challenges. Balin, I'm going to come to you sort of from an ILO perspective. Are you seeing this sort of play out at a country level? And you able to see clearly sort of where that's having sort of the most impact? And is there anything that, can be put in place to sort of help change that landscape?
Yes, thank you. So yeah, we see that precarious or in general vulnerable workers or groups of workers, they tend to face higher risks than the counterparts with a more normalized working environment or working conditions. But when it comes whether we see it clearly in administrative records, unfortunately the answer is usually no. And the reason is that occupational safety and health or the data of it is strongly rooted in administrative records. So registered workers and the claims or injuries which been compensated on registers, those are the information we usually receive. And if a worker is not registered to start with, then chances are that the injury happening to the worker will just go on completely unnoticed. So in that regard, surveys like the Work Risk Pool or other surveys which actually ask the experience of workers from households, those are the only information where we actually see the experience of these marginalized groups of workers. And oftentimes, if these instruments are not targeting specifically to say migrant workers or remote locations, then even in that, it's difficult to grasp. So on that sense, we unfortunately know it's happening. We have reports, but there is no global comprehensive picture of the magnitude of these things, unfortunately.
Thank you. So very much a data gap there. So in terms of sort of some of those challenges around those sort of groups of workers, and I'm also thinking about the sort of barriers to training, language related potentially, or a lack of resources in certain industries or countries, or technology, right? People's competence or availability of the technology to help them if that's the way they learn better. So how can we address some of those different challenges, do we think? And Sarah, I'm going to come to you if I may.
Yeah, I think kind of feeding off of something I said earlier is, as an employer, you have to understand who your employees are, right? And the responsibility is on the employer, no matter if your workers are around for a couple of days or not. The responsibility is really ensuring that that person is, like Chris said, fit for duty, fit for work. I think part of it is understanding the modes in which your employees receive information and receive training. Usually they like it best in their native language and provided by someone that looks like them and receives information like them. I understand that some organizations or countries may not have the resources to be providing augmented reality training, right? But I think just based on what your resources are, understanding that before someone goes out on the job, they need to be equipped with the information to complete the job safely. So I think really it kind of starts with doing these perception surveys with your employees. It could be as sophisticated as, full survey that's electronic, or just going out and talking to people, like what Alan said. But really, it has to start with understanding what your employees look like, from a perspective of the language that they speak, how they receive information, and then building it from there. But to say that it's too hard, we can't just stop with that, right? You have to go out and at least start with something.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. That's really helpful. Chris, I want to pick up on something that you said earlier around sort of particular challenges in the construction industry around. I'm just wondering if there's sort of gender related barriers to training. I don't know the sort of gender breakdowns of workers in the construction industry, but I would hazard a guess that there's more male workers in construction than female. And does that bring
Sure.
its own challenges in how people are likely to report or how open they are to training?
Yeah, I think there has been, obviously, it's been a male-dominated frontline industry. That is changing, though. So it is changing quite fast, particularly with the generation coming through now. We're seeing, particularly in the construction trades, a lot of young women entering those trades and starting off careers there. So what that does mean is that, look, there's training needs that go along with that. There's PPE needs that go along with that. There's site needs that go along with that as well. It's a real change, and that's I think it's being embraced a lot more with the generation of young males that are coming through at the same time. It's probably the older males within the sites that we're having to educate and sort of make sure that there's a good understanding and inclusiveness there for that. But nevertheless, it's not a impossible problem to deal with. It's one that most of us probably listening on this website probably would acknowledge that we kind of know what we should be doing in that area anyway. It's just a recognition of that to encourage those people. So I don't think. I think there's an opportunity in it as well, Beth, in that young women and women in general have a different perspective on a lot of things, particularly around health and safety, particularly risk, and different ways of dealing with it as well. So in some ways, it's a great opportunity because we haven't had that sort of level of collective thinking in the construction industry for the last 200 years. And maybe that will be one of the things that actually changes it in the future.
Yeah. Yes, hopefully so. Right, just one more question I'm going to put to the panel, and then we'll go to audience Q&A. Alan, I want to come to you because sort of I know you've said a few things about let's look at the positives, let's try and see what can be done. So we've looked at the challenges and the barriers. What do you think are the biggest enablers for training in the fishing industries?
Well, Beth, I'm going to be a good politician and answer your question with something completely different, if I may. But can I ask you and anybody that's on this webinar that when they go into their retailer and they decide to buy a piece of fish, or they go into a nice restaurant and from the menu they choose a bit of fish, what do they think about when they make that choice? The sense that I have is that most people, if they do think about it, will think, well, has that fish or has that shellfish been harvested sustainably? And I know and throughout my career, I think about the amount of money that has been invested in educating the public about the sustainability of fisheries. And really the amount of money that has been spent training the humans to make them survive this profession pales into insignificance. Now, the point that I want to make very loud and clearly, Beth, is that the two go hand in hand. Safety and sustainability of the ocean's fish stocks go very much hand in hand. And improved safety practices, which are underpinned by the international standards that I've referred to during this conversation, really do empower fishers to move away from overfishing towards a more long-term sustainable model, which ensures the livelihood of fishers, the sustainability of fish and shellfish stocks, and the survival of many local remote communities. So what I'm getting to, Beth, to answer your question, is a partnership approach here. Clearly, IFS is a partnership between Lloyd's Register Foundation, the Seafarers Charity, and the Fish Platform. But the question is, how do we implement IFS on the ground? How do we provide that training? And over the last number of months, that's meant engagement with ENGOs, who maybe traditionally were just entirely focused on the sustainability of fish stocks, but are now increasingly thinking, well, it's as much about the humans. It's as much about feeding the world with the protein that the sea and fresh water can provide. So it's establishing those partnerships. It's a whole mixture of different enablers. The language issues comes into it, the education levels, all of that comes into it. But it's looking for more partners, because this kind of work on a global stage, Beth, requires resource. Lloyd's Register has stepped forth with the resource. But I think from where I'm sitting now, we need a lot more people, be it within the seafood industry and those that have any sort of interest in the seafood industry, to step forward and really put the money on the table as well. That's the key to addressing this problem.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Alan. Look, we've had lots of questions come in, and I'm trying to do my best to go through some of these while you've all been talking. But Aaron, I'm going to come to you first. There's been quite a few questions around the methodology behind the data collection of the World Risk Poll. So looking at sort of in which countries, was it in just English, or was it adapted into sort of different languages? How was the data actually collected? Was it through surveys or talking to people? So I wonder if you could just give us a bit more insight into the methodology.
Yep, so for a real in-depth insight into the methodology, there is a file on our website that you can download that will go into this in all the detail and give you the breakdown on an individual country level. But to sort of address the questions generally, it was 142 countries globally. The languages would be adjusted and not just translated, but localized to provide context for people. So it's not just delivered in English, it's delivered in the respondent's native language in terms that make sense to them. And then the polling techniques, it varies depending on the country. So a large majority is face-to-face interviews. Gallup, our polling partners, have a really detailed methodology where they'll place people on the ground, and they have a randomized methodology of going around houses and polling people of their responses. Some of it will be done by phone methodology, and in China we went with a web-based methodology this year as well. But yes, like I said, there's a big methodology file that goes into this in great detail if you want to read more.
That's great, thank you very much. We've had a question which I think is really interesting around psychological safety in the workplace, and what organisations are doing or what can be done to sort of better keep people safe with regards to that, rather than sort of physical harm in the workplace. Would anybody in particular like to comment on that? Balint?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's I would say an emerging issue, but it's not known. It's more like the focus is moving that way. So on the ILO, recently we had a new convention on violence and harassment at work, which addresses part of those issues or the core of then the psychological outcomes of these risks and hazards. But also we see a huge growth in reported cases of mental illnesses, especially in elderly labor force, which been growing in the last 5 to 10 years, which pointing to the direction that this is so far a bit underlooked part of the occupational safety and health, which has, if we are going to the optimistic way, saying that other risks are gone away so we can concentrate on the more long-term impacts of our work. But as we saw today, it's not necessarily the case of all workers, but this is definitely something which is growing into attention.
That's great, thank you. Did anybody else want to comment on that? Oh,
Yeah,
Aaron.
Beth.
And Chris. Go, Chris.
Yeah. Look, the construction industry's got very, very high levels of around the world of suicide, unfortunately, and we know there's a couple of reasons for that. One is we have a demographic that works within construction that are at risk anyway. So 18 to 24-year-old young men, and also 45 to 55-year-old business owners. So they're both high risk groups anyway. So look, there's a lot of work being done at the moment in terms of supporting and looking at the causes of that within the construction industry. Things like peer-to-peer networks, encouraging early help seeking, connecting them to services through organisations like Mates in Construction are doing great work. And also there's a lot of work being done to understand that, it's a body and mind challenge. So I mentioned the musculoskeletal issue within construction. It's also, a big issue in terms of just keeping people mentally well and actually resilient in their working lives as well. And what can we do on that? So there's focuses both on keeping people well and also of making sure that little problems don't turn into big problems by getting people early help as well. So that is a big focus in a lot of areas in a lot of countries.
Thank you, Chris. Aaron, I'm going to come to you.
It was just a quick comment on top of what Balint said about talking about Convention 190. In 2021, our World Risk Poll, we had a module dedicated to violence and harassment in the workplace. And it was interesting and surprising to us that psychological harm was by far the biggest chunk that people reported, more so than physical and sexual harm. So it's definitely a big issue in the workplace. What was interesting was then the different demographics and how they explained that psychological harm and how they felt comfortable about reporting it, because physical harm, people maybe felt more comfortable about reporting it, but we definitely saw different demographic responses around psychological harm and people feeling comfortable to report it. So I think there's definitely a big area of interest there as well.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And that report's available on the Foundation's website too, if anybody wants to have a look at it. Another question from the audience. What other ways are there that people can be trained aside from sitting in a classroom? And Chris, I know you kind of mentioned before, on-the-job training is really welcome in the construction industry by some groups. Are there any other sort of training sort of programs that you've seen happen in practice that you think has been particularly effective? And anybody want to comment on that?
I can take that one. So we have the Campbell Institute within the National Safety Council has a report on kind of training modes and evaluating effectiveness of those training modules. And really we've seen that, like I've talked about, it's whatever will work at your organization, but there are modes like on the job, e-learnings, there's kind of VR, AR using emerging technologies. A lot of people are using kind of the mixed models. So maybe you do an e-learning and then you go out and do a competency test on the job to make sure that you've actually received that information. But in the US, we're seeing that a lot of organizations are going to more e-learning styles, just so it's a little bit easier. People can take it at their own pace. That's what's nice about kind of those e-learnings, especially if it's more than just lecture style. It's showing scenarios and that type of thing on the computer.
I know as well, Beth, in this age of YouTube and TikTok, and a lot of the new generation are actually used to consuming their learning in other areas by short and effective videos. So whether you're baking a cake or trying to fix your car, you generally go on and find something there. And look, I should talk to Alan about this as well, because in the New Zealand fishing industry, they found that very effective in actually providing really short, sharp, direct videos for our fishers to learn on, and that's been a great success for them.
And this hasn't been rehearsed, just to coming on from Chris, but I was just about to mention the example of New Zealand, because certainly in our sector, generally in the global south where the focus is, Beth, there are no classrooms, and the biggest challenge is actually the multiple languages over thousands of islands remotely spread through Southeast Asia into the Pacific. And actually, Chris, is following up on your point that we're working with a partner in New Zealand who's looking to use virtual reality and use satellite systems to deliver training remotely, maybe from a base in New Zealand, but throughout the Pacific Islands. So like the technology is there. It's just getting the resource, getting the people in place that we can utilize that technology. So thanks for the introduction, Chris.
Balint, did you want to add something as
Yes,
well?
I wanted to build upon the previous comments. So I would like to mention that training is one shouldn't only understand training as delivered to the workers themselves. I think it's really important also to train the employers as well. And it's also linked to the point Ellen mentioned earlier on the sustainability of the business. I mean, workforce, it's of course a legal responsibility to keep the workers safe, healthy, alive, but it's also a good business practice. I mean, if you don't have anyone tomorrow to go to your ship and fish, then you won't have a fish to sell. But it's also, so it's important to raise awareness on the employer side to the importance of the safety of their own labor force, because you often see is not a bad or ill wish of the employer to not provide training. It's oftentimes it's simply a missing awareness of the employer side as well, that this is an important issue at the workplace.
Thank you. I'm going to stick with that sort of legal responsibility thread there, because we've had a question in around reporting. So the question is, did the poll find any associations or positive indications, either at the regional or country level, for those places that mandate formal reporting routes? So are we seeing any kind of correlation there? And is that, is that actually a thing where reporting is mandated, or is it more about organisations, choosing to do this? Balint.
Well, on the part of whether reporting is mandated or not, I think that's it is. That's the part by labor law. If an employer must keep records of injuries, diseases, oftentimes also accidents which does not result in health loss, but the damage of physical object, etc. And if there is an injury, there is usually a well-established route based on the national legislation how the employer should report it into national authorities, labor inspectorates, doctors, etc. So it's in all countries, I mean, all member states of the ILO, where occupational safety and health is a fundamental principle of right. This is also legally binding to do all these steps.
I think a clarifying statement there too is that it's the responsibility of the employer, but I don't think anywhere states that employees are legally bound to tell or to report. So I think maybe just opening up that level of communication, because we know that employers have to, if they know about an injury or illness, they need to report it. But we don't have that kind of overall national bounds where employees have to. Each organization might have their own standard around that, but we could probably do more around the employee level.
And how does that work in the informal sector? I mean, yes, I understand it's a sort of legal responsibility for employers, but if you're self-employed or a much sort of smaller scale industry, how does that work in practice? Any thoughts?
Think of it, Beth, that is the big challenge. If you're a fisher, a single person operator on a canoe someplace in West Africa or in Asia, as I mentioned earlier, first of all, there's no mechanism to report accidents or harm. And probably then, if you're in that situation where your occupation really is feeding your family, well, then, as Sarah mentioned earlier, there is that normalization, there is that pressure that I can't afford to report this, I can't afford to take time off. Yeah. There's no insurance, there's no backup. I'm it, I have to keep going.
Yes, and that's a question that's been playing on my mind. Does that affect people's attitude to risk when they're in that situation? If every piece of fish that they catch, is going to feed their family or their local community, are they more likely to take high risks? Because for them, there's a lot at stake.
Well, right? I believe they are. Like normal risk, acceptable level of risk. Is there such a thing as acceptable level of risks in 2024? Should we just treat it as the norm that there's something like 32,000 fishers dying every year And the time it has taken to deliver this webinar, there's 4 or 5 fishers have died someplace in the world. Is that just an acceptable risk that we can all take? I certainly don't believe so. And I think that's before we even start to talk, Beth, about emerging risks and new risks, for example, with great green fuels, and how that then translates into all of our sectors, be it the fishing sector. What training is being delivered to address the risks associated with alternatives to dirty diesel in this sector. So there's all sorts of issues in there that, yes, we can help resolve them through resource, through money, through training. But the other lesson that I've learned is that there's an important issue here in terms of knowledge exchange, Beth. And certainly, as over the last number of months, I found what is a problem in one part of the world, actually somebody in another part of the world has already come up with a solution or is looking at that. So it's really, really useful to establish those links, get people talking, and have that knowledge transfer.
Absolutely. Yeah, across sort of geographical borders, but also across industries, right? I think that there's learnings that can be shared. Which kind of leads nicely onto a question around standards. How do we sort of learn across countries and industries, but also is there a need, and how do we harmonise health and safety standards, in different parts of the world?
Yeah, I think to a certain degree, I mean, I'll speak for the construction sector again. We know the main mechanisms why construction workers are seriously harmed and died around the world. It doesn't tend to change. So falling from heights, being electrocuted, having things drop on you, entrenchment type issues, and being hit by mobile vehicles and plant tend to be the top sort of 5 or 6 reasons, and that doesn't change around the world because the nature of we all sort of build buildings and houses pretty much the same way to a certain degree. So once we know that, there is a really big opportunity for saying, hey, look, we know the context of that construction can change from site to site, location to location, environment to environment, country to country, but there's a lot of cross-pollination and learning that's possible, and a lot of research that's possible. So what we've found is really useful is to go to those bodies of knowledge, those really good evidence bases, organisations like the CSRA in Colorado, RMIT in Australia for our part of the world, where we're actually doing evidence-based research on saying, hey, what are the most effective interventions and controls? And these tend to be pretty consistent around the world. So that opportunity for learning is right there. And look, that's what we do as our organisation. We go out there and we harvest the world's knowledge and then try and bring it back and make it consumable for the everyday small business operator on a site. Because often these academic and research-based projects are written in a certain way that's not consumable for those people. So what we're trying to do is actually be the translator to actually say, look, this is what the research says, this is how you do it on site, and this is what's going to work for you the best.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm not sure whose hand went up first. Alan, I'll come to you, and then to Balint. Oh, it was Balint, was it?
It was Balint, but I'm sure he'll forgive me because I'm going to give him hopefully a good introduction now. I think we have in our sector minimum standards that are there through the good work of the ILO. I'm thinking, Balint, of ILO C188, which addresses many of the welfare issues that fishers face throughout the world. Through the International Maritime Organization, we have minimum standards when it comes to training crew and watchkeeping for fishers. But the next challenge we have is, yes, having the minimum standards at the global level, but having them applied at the national level. And it's something that puzzles me, Beth, that even when you look at the ILO standards that apply to the merchant fleet, they've been ratified by over 100 countries worldwide, where the same standards that apply to the fishing fleet, I stand to be corrected, Balint, have been ratified by about 30 countries worldwide. And the same picture emerges for the IMO. So where is the problem? It's not at international standard. We have those minimum standards. Is it at national level? Is it below that? But the standards in many ways are there. It's just making sure that they can be delivered right down to the coast.
Thank you, Alan. Over to you, Balint.
Yeah, thanks for the great introduction. So the first correction, unfortunately, 188, the fishing convention only ratified by 22 countries, not even 30. So that's indeed a big bottleneck of having standards applied. I mean, standard is a piece of paper until it actually implemented at every workplace, and then it starts having effects. Now, in that regard, we also have standards for construction, agriculture, and occupational safety and health. The two fundamental ones, in a sense, cover all aspects, all in workers and all industries in principle. And they have the added benefit that without ratification, simply due to the fact that a country is a member of the International Labour Organization, has the obligation to implement and promote these standards. And they form the blueprint of a national system, how an occupational safety and health should work towards preventing harm. And they have description of the collaboration between workers and employers, so how reporting should happen, which authorities should take in part, and to make sure that that harms are prevented. So I really feel that international standards for these we already have plenty. What is really missing is the implementation at the national level and then at the workplace level, that everyone who is involved knows the rights and obligations these standards have.
Thank you very much. I'm very conscious of the time. I think we might have time for one or maybe a push two more questions. So I know there's been lots, but we'll try and get back to everybody after this if we don't get to your particular question. But an interesting one, I think, Chris, you mentioned earlier about evidence needed for effective interventions, and someone from the audience has asked what types of evidence are needed to make sure those interventions are effective.
Yeah, well, I think what we like to see is evidence in practice as well. So ideally, we've got peer-reviewed, scientific type approaches to actually understanding what the interventions are that work, because it is a complex socio-technical environment that we're working in. And unfortunately, what we have seen is a lot of interventions come out which really haven't had much evidence behind them as well, particularly in the psychosocial area and the wellbeing area. And it can be actually almost quite dangerous. So we really do need a clear level of intervention there. So one of the issues we've seen with the research-based process, though, is it often takes up to 10 years for research to actually start to when it actually gets out the other end of the research process, and by then kind of the industry's moved on. What we are seeing now, though, is organisations starting to accelerate that research process. So I mentioned a couple of organisations before, but the general theme there is like working with industry rather than in isolation with academia. And industry and academia working together, doing practical-based research on site with real people on real tools, taking about 2 years to actually complete that research. And the research is very much based on achieving tangible outcomes. So it's not just about saying, hey, look, let's try and solve an interesting research problem, which may or may not be able to be utilised in the field, which just becomes safety trivia. It's about saying, look, let's actually work on something that we can change and find actually the right way of doing something. So we are seeing that approach change to evidence-based, and a lot of the grey literature and the non-scientific or non-evidence-based stuff starting to recede a little bit, which is good.
Yeah, and I will kind of add on to that to give a shameless plug for some work that we're doing within the MSD Solutions Lab at NSC. We are actually funding grants and research to solutions and pilot grants for organizations that would like to test out emerging technology to reduce MSDs, or also for research institutions to partner with organizations to kind of create these solutions. So we do this annually, and our next grant cycle will open up in December. So I think for anyone interested in looking into these different funding opportunities, they are there. So reach out to us at any time.
That's great, and that's a great comment for us to wrap up with. I think, Sarah. So thank you. So we've literally got a few seconds left. So I just want to take the opportunity to say a huge thank you to our panelists for such an interesting and informative discussion, and to everybody that's joined us today. We really do appreciate it. I'm sorry we couldn't get through all the questions that were sent in, but as I said earlier, we will follow up with you if we didn't get to answer your question or comments. Aaron mentioned earlier the full report and all the data can be explored on the World Risk Poll website. And then you can get in touch with us if you're interested in partnering with us, with the foundation, with working with us, or just commenting or wanting any more clarity on that data. We can certainly help you there. When you leave the webinar, you're going to get a short feedback survey, so please do fill that in and send it back to us. We'd be really interested to hear what you think. But on behalf of Lloyd's Register Foundation and all our fantastic panelists, thank you again for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day, wherever you are. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thanks.
Thanks, Beth. Thank you.
Thank you.